By air at all. It's one facet, one perhaps small part of their overall work as designers. I mean, I'm sure you all know yourself that you have many interests and kind of parallel pursuits that you undergo, and we just thought for this conference to just kind of select kind of a very small, narrow idea about a facet of design that we each can work with and develop with more. Obviously, the work is very different between the three, but obviously, it shares a sort of a commitment to understanding kind of the flows and the movement of air in the environment. So to kind of start it off, Tom kind of alluded to it in his lecture. Well, he actually listed it as one of the questions he had for it is, can you get out of the kind of functional sort of we need to just deliver buildings, like are we producing better HVAC, right, type question, and also, can you sort of separate it from, however important it is, the kind of sustainable associations with air, which is being heavily legislated in Europe right now in terms of kind of building form and the kind of requirements for massing, and kind of just, I guess, begin it with talking a little bit more about air, kind of as beyond that, kind of going back a little bit, I think Neil's comment and some of your comments about utopianism being kind of dead, sort of this sort of environment of the air itself being this sort of magical kind of component of the architecture is perhaps lost, but it's not really, right? And we all still design in the ways of environments, right? So beyond kind of the functionalism and the sustainability that we all know is important with it, right? How else might we start the conversation with just discussion of it being kind of part of environment?
One of the things that I thought was really interesting, both not loud, about Tom's, maybe not loud enough, about both Tom's and Ante's presentations was basically what to do with the 1960s, which is really interesting to me. So we can do as Tom did, which is to say he's a formalist, and so in that way we choose one strand of the 1960s over another, which is perhaps a kind of, say, environmental design idea of what architecture might be. And so we can say, for example, that the 60s are themselves, having produced an idea of obsolescence through archigram, that the 60s, those strands of ideas are themselves tired and irrelevant, and so we posit a form of obsolescence against obsolescence itself. And so in that way, open at least for me, a kind of vacuum for the insertion of another idea from the 1960s, which is formalism. On the other hand, we could always examine, say, Rayner Banham, which we all must, since we live in the Los Angeles area. So we read one book, which is The Four Ecologies, and if we read two books, we read The Four Ecologies plus The Well-Tempered Environment, moving laterally, right? And so if we move over to Ante Liu's ideas of how to read Rayner Banham, again, we turn to an idea of extending the standard of living package into something like cloud or something into a kind of urban form. But in both cases, it seems to me that the 1960s will not die. And so we end up talking about, say, the indexical architecture of the Centre Pompidou, or we end up talking about Rayner Banham, when in LA, we do as the Romans do and speak about LA as Rayner Banham did. Or we posit the failure of the utopian 1960s project again. And so I wonder if there will ever be a release in Los Angeles. Will there ever be a release both from the kind of oppositions around utopianism and opposition, say, between a kind of formal imperative versus a kind of environmental imperative? I just wonder whether, if 2012 is, if we can't do it yet, I wonder when we finally will.
I have a soft spot for the 1960s and 70s, but I think, it's a really interesting observation that you make. I think that one reason I feel an affinity for the 60s is that there are kind of such serious and politicized discussions going on, but there is such a kind of an innate will to form at the same time, accompanying the critique, and that's one thing. I mean, not to sound overly nostalgic, I mean that's something that I feel like sometimes we're missing these days. I don't know whether it was the culture of the time that just like, well, even if you want to poke fun at something, you create something fantastic, as a way of saying what you think, right? Whereas sometimes I think that we've become kind of sort of too efficient and sort of like lost some sort of aspect of the sort of imaginary potentials surrounding some of the things that we're critiquing and observing.
I agree with that. I mean, I think, though, on the flip side, I actually hold more optimism maybe for now, because I think architects are really getting down to the brass tacks of things. I mean, what was exciting, I think, about the last project in the movie we saw from Philippe was that now this is a real project and there's real technology, and those solutions are not going to be just evocative, but actually actuated. And for me, that's what's exciting to see in the work, is a real synthesis of technology, of materiality, of tectonics and technology, but with a utopian agenda where we are to actually solve sort of real problems. So
I think there is something completely different between the 60s and today, but in the same time, maybe it arrived to the same tools, but the causes are completely different. In the 60s, of course, it was a time where we have the idea that the energy was endless. We could, with the nuclear power, with everything, you could use the energy you want. When you read books from this period, it's completely clear. And I read a book from Michel Ragon, for example. He explained all the utopian project linked with this. There is absolutely no the energy is you could use all the energy you want. So this period was linked with this idea. You don't need any more to have a roof, because you could blow air to cut the water. You could you don't need insulation, because you could warm with enormous radiator. So it was this idea, and all this utopian idea fall down. Of course, there is a political end of utopia during the 70s, but it's also it matched with the oil crisis, with the 74 crisis of energy, and it is another point of view on postmodernism. Why Aldo Rossi and this small window come back, and the chair is no more. You don't lie on the floor, but you come back into a chair where you need to be straight on it, because the energy become a problem, and you have to economize, and you have to build again wall, and so and today I think the link with climatic element with the air is a consequence of sustainability, because in sustainability you have to reduce the energy, the temperature, and they say, okay, don't warm the bedroom at 20 degrees Celsius, but keep it at 16 degrees Celsius, or don't change the air too many times for 1 hour, because you lose a lot of energy. So all this question of air and climate come back, but from the reverse side of the utopian side, but in the same time, maybe it's linked to the last project in Taiwan. Of course, there is also this idea of sustainable energy with green windmill and solar panel and everything, and this technology today is not strong enough to change completely everything. But when it will become, when you could abandon nuclear and oil and fossil energy, so we could come back to really utopian moment again. And for the Taiwan project, of course, all the devices we place are the energy came from sustainable energy produced on the site directly. And so it's why I think, for me personally, it's not really nostalgia of the 16. It's only that the period forced us to rethink about climate and to rethink about the energy and the climate as a main element of architecture.
I just want to say that I would be a little concerned, though, that that with all the interest in sustainability recently, that we begin to dissolve that which has driven the discipline of architecture for thousands of years, and that is, in my opinion, the things which exceed function and exceed structure and exceed basically engineering issues in general. And I think, although I have a very soft place in my heart for engineering because I'm interested in building, of course, I think that if we extract out let's call it for a minute, maybe the excess, which is architecture, and I don't mean excessive architecture, like excessive form, I just mean that the excess, that which is outside of engineering, if we strip that out, I think we potentially create a dead end for architecture, where we are trying to solve society's problems, which is a problem that was tried and was failed by the modernists. And I think that we also potentially get off track with a much larger lineage of architecture, disciplinary architecture, not just building, but the discipline of architecture, which has a trajectory, which does in fact involve aesthetics, and does in fact involve architects making decisions about space and materials and proportions and form and edges and joints and all those things that make an architecture. And so, I don't know, Philippe, maybe back to you then. I noticed in your presentation, I thought it was really interesting how ruthlessly you showed plans of things. There was one interior image of a space, and I was just waiting for it. I was so happy to see it. And then I was curious, well, you didn't say anything about it at all. And I could tell it's clearly you're going to great lengths to avoid talking about that. But like, how would you characterize the architecture that your project with a capital P is producing?
But I think it's all the element you talk about, join or about proportion. I think maybe, or hierarchy, or we could adapt it maybe to the void, to say, okay, what is the join between oxygen and nitrogen, or what is the join between cold air and warm air, or what is the proportion of cold in the space and warm. So I think all this quality of architecture could shift from the visible to the invisible, and from the static or from the solid element to the void, emptiness element. And I think, for me, in a polemic way, I think there is a kind of error in the history of architecture, because architecture, it is to create a space. It's the difference between architecture and sculpture. I think sculpture, it's an object, it's a convex object, and you see it, you define the proportion of the object, and it's a material. But the goal of architecture is not the object itself, it is a void that is created by the solid element. It's why in the utopian project of the 60s we abandon the wall, the roof, because it's not really architecture. It's just to create architecture we need wall, but in a certain way this is not what we want for architecture. What we want, it is to define a climate where there is no rain, or when it's more warm when it's cold, or more cold when it's warm. So so in a certain way I think the void is really the most important element of architecture. And if we could abandon all the visible, for me, I think it's good. But and I think also in a certain way.
how do you define the void if you don't define the edges of the void? I mean, how do you?
I think it's interesting also in the history of art. For example, I was thinking, you know, in the history of the painting, for example, the edge, the line was during a long time. It was when you paint, you have a painting, you must define by the edge the figure, and you have the background. But in the history of art, all the painter want to escape from this, and Leonardo da Vinci creates the sfumato effect when he apply a lot of layer of vernis, yes, to create a blurring effect between the first plan, the first figure, and the background. And after, I just read when there is the invention of the photography, it's really interesting because Austrian photographer of the 19th century explained that he do a study of gradation, because when you do a photo, you don't have any more line or edge. You just have different intensity of black and white. You know, it's but you could not say, okay, this figure stop here and this figure start here. It's just a variation of gradation. And I think maybe in the last project for the Taiwan project, we work a little in this idea of gradation. It's there is not a space with edge and another space. It's just variation of the space, and so it's yes.
But how do you? Okay, so how do you? Sorry, I'm just going to keep on this because I feel like there's something here, and not that.
Anxiety is well placed. I think his anxiety is well placed because air, as understood as, say, void, which is perhaps only one of the dimensions of possibility within the idea of what air might be, is indeed threatening to a certain aspect of the formalist practice. In other words, right away we start imagining a slippery slope. Does that mean that architecture itself will fade away? As if that were ever possible. Does that mean that excess, that is not excessive architecture, but excess itself, which embodies architecture, will itself fade away and thus take architecture with it? And there, in that way, we can unpack a little bit that air, despite the fact that it is invisible, is absolutely undermining and subversive to a certain form of formalist practice. In exactly the same way, if we align certain aspects of formalist plastics to practice to a kind of technological imperative, we can see the same threat playing itself out in your story of the antibiotic, which is to say that if we only take these pills brought to us by technology, we can return to the old cities and not, say, remain married to modernist form at all. Yeah.
But I think we could also be formalist with the air. You know, I don't. Also, when the reason also why I don't show image, I just show plan and section. There is only one image of this indoor space. Because at one moment when in the process of my work, I have no image at the beginning. I just start to work with element and to see, and the image arrive at the end. And sometimes I'm not so happy with the image. I think, oh, it's not so good. So it's why I have a problem with the image at the end, and also it's a lack of work. I must work more to arrive to the good image. But it's also I come back to the idea of architecture, and when you read text from the guy from I will find it in the 17th century in Italy. He say I forget the name, but it says that the architect don't have to use a perspective. No, he don't have to use image. He just have to work with plan and section, and the perspective is only for the painter. And it's not allow for the architect. It's to use 3D image. He must only work on plan and section, and there is this separation between painter, that use 3D image, perspective, and architect working on plan and section. And it was Raphael and yes, Raffaello, and it was a letter from Raffaello to somebody in the 17th century. And I think, of course, there is this very visible formalist from the before the crisis, before 2008. With a lot of formalists, and of course I think it was a strategy also to escape to this visual formalist, to come back to this very work on the plan.
Tom, I mean, I'm kind of really fascinated by your question and your kind of assertion that it is a threat, and you know, I think it's that tension that's always been interesting in the 20th century, like sort of like the line where, you know, science turns into art and vice versa, and where something purports to the question of performance, you know, so there's scientific performance, but there's also sort of visual and spatial performance as well, which are harder to measure. And I think what you're getting at, Tom, is maybe the idea or the fear that some of our endeavors now, given the kind of predicament we find ourselves in, you know, could be solved as much by going on an Excel spreadsheet, you know, to kind of come up with the best architectural even solution.
Well, I'm not sure if I like that. I like what you just said. I'm not sure if that's exactly what I was saying though. What I actually believe, I'll just say it. I think that you do have an aesthetic approach, and I think it's minimalism. I don't think that you have, Philippe. I mean, just from what I get, I haven't really seen your work before today, although I looked at it the other day, and you seem to be a minimalist, which has formal and disciplinary roots. It's not, you know what I mean? I don't see it necessarily, and again, you gave us the glimpse of it, and I understand what you were saying, that it's fluctuating, it's in a state of forming itself, but minimalism vis-a-vis modernism, I mean, there is a certain trajectory there that it seems like your work might be a part of, if you are to build it. Like, let's say we look at the Chinese project, and I saw these devices. You talked about it mostly in terms of what they did, but not how they appeared. But then as we got the elevations flying by, I noticed there was something that looked like a geodesic dome. Then there was something with filleted edges. The single surface architecture project of the 90s, where you have a surface that can then fill it and then become other things, seemed to be there. There was a dome there. There seemed to be some formalisms there that were coming up, and then the interior view too, the fluid forms, the rounding off the corners, which you explained as needing to do for noise and turbulence of the duct, which I understand space as duct. But I just want to say that even that has formal underpinnings, and you know, I don't mean this as an attack at all. I'm just thinking out loud that like it just seems like when you don't talk about it at all, it doesn't mean that it's not there. It just means you didn't talk about it.
But it also seems. Can I just add something?
Yeah.
It also seems like in your work, and I don't mean this as a critique, but more as a commentary, that it falls between one of two things to define it. Either it's a radiating system where there's a source that radiates out, and therefore the definition is just by the range of that radiation. And then there's the sense that there's a filtration system, right? So in the pool project, I think it is, you talked about the cool air coming from around, the hot humid air is heating up those smaller spaces, and it's where it's the definition between those two worlds that, to me, I start to see that form. And that form, in your words, I think, seems to be more significant in how it operates as opposed to its actual form itself. And so seeing it in plan or in section seems to be acceptable enough. But the question beyond it is, you talk about just being a conductive surface, or in the Taiwanese park, you know, I mean, the description of the material seems to beg for more information for someone like me, who deals with a lot of tectonics and hardcore materiality and seemingly formality, but again, dealing with that filtration system.
Perhaps that just questions of form are not the most interesting questions to ask these, to try to kind of understand these projects better, because all it seems to do is indicate what they lack, which is not to say what they contain, or what directions they might point us to. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting, to go back to Ante's work, which is, I wonder what, I mean, just to kind of, I see how your work insists on this very old idea of hygiene, and then somehow using technology to accelerate or build up that idea of hygiene until it produces something like its opposite, which is the very excess that perhaps maybe Tom was not talking about, but nevertheless used the term, right? A kind of excessive hygiene, which produces what? And maximizes the carbon footprint, or I'm not sure what exactly it does, but it produces that tingling effect that you talked about in the white space, which is something that we perceive through our kind of our senses, our bodies. So nevertheless, somehow that kind of that excess is producing an effect on us that we can understand, or rather perceive, if not understand.
There's real effect. There's psychological effect as well. I'm very, interested in a placebo effect as well, because that does produce wellness. It's proven, right?
Have you ever measured the air purity of your projects, or the number? I mean, is there any measurable thing?
No, I haven't. Partially because I didn't have the equipment, but partially because part of the reason I put these things into play is just for each individual, to think about, what kind of effect it has on them, whether they can feel it or whether they feel better or whether they care, or what the nature of their desire, is, for the quality of their environment. And yeah, so no, sorry, I forgot, sort of lost a. No, you're the part of your question that
well, I guess I wondered. I mean, in essence, for a lot of architects in a kind of a modern mode of practice, the real media for architecture is space, rather than say materials or envelopes or anything like that. It's the kind of space that it contains. And for you, it seems like it's not exactly space. It's something like a kind of a breathable constructed object, which is the kind of invisible component of the clouds and apparatuses that you use as the kind of visible companion.
It's the kind of gradient that we saw.
But but I'm kind of interested in this stuff, that produces the phenomenon and the visualization of it. And it's interesting, the conversation we're having, because it makes me think of like the project Matter that I did in a different way. Like, I'm kind of interested in the air, definitely what's in it, but I'm not a scientist and I'm not a meteorologist. I'm an artist. So if that didn't produce an interesting representation, I probably wouldn't look into it.
Right. But you turned them on. You turned them on.
Oh, yes, I did. Yeah. But not as a scientific, not as a rigorous scientific experiment, I guess you could say.
Yeah, I like very much the exactly that part of your work, the effect that goes beyond, let's say, a demonstration piece, or a one-liner like look what's in your ceiling, look what's behind your walls, kind of thing, to these atmospheric effects that you get of these star-filled skies, which I just thought were fabulous, or the disco duct space that you're in, which just yeah.
Ante, I think for me, your work embodies a little bit what Sanford Quinter was talking about, this kind of moment when there was a switch to sustainability, that we, he sort of conceived of looking at buildings in terms of thermodynamics instead of, just tectonics, right? That the tectonics was old and thermodynamics were new. And your projects to me are very much about this kind of energy exchange, right? This sort of like, you know, even if it's not a scientific condition, it's one where there's an exchange occurring, right? You actually titled one of your pieces "Exchange," right? Where there's this kind of like interactivity with the kind of atmosphere and the environment and the people and you know, potentially even the architecture of the environment, right? And I think that's sort of fascinating, right? The thermodynamics, I think, is a pretty interesting sort of, if you take that as a kind of buildings being energy exchanges, right? And this, I mean, Tommy raised the idea about, you know, the possibility of engineering being reduced and therefore reducing kind of collectively everything across the board. I mean, there's also this kind of moment where, and it's hard to see from both of your presentations, where, you know, sort of behind the scenes, the kind of process, right? So for, you know, I'm a designer, so this is kind of a designy type of question, but how much do you sort of use or software to, let's say, model like the specific flows or the conditions of what you're working on, in essence, to literally kind of shape the form based on kind of the you know, like if we're talking about kind of, you know, to loop it sort of subtly back into formalism in a way, how do you kind of use engineering in its kind of advanced state, the kind of ability to fabricate sort of new means and let's say the opportunities for that, and say the software to kind of producing it, right? So, Tom, I mean, we saw your forms right there, but we don't know necessarily the backstory, like of how those kind of capillary systems, let's say, would work. You know, if you were to sort of analyze it, and same thing with you, Philippe. Like we saw the renderings of the plans with the kind of the different fields of colors that recognize temperature, but you know, as part of a design process, I guess, and kind of coming to form, do you use any sort of ways to model atmosphere?
Okay. The easy answer is no, because the thing that I showed, I guess maybe you're talking about the batwing thing. You know, that was really also a kind of a provocation. It was for an art museum, actually. It was a piece of art. It is, however, also in my mind a prototype for architecture, and it is based on, let's say, redesigning a fan coil unit is what it is, really. So it's a water-to-air system, because water is very, I consider way more efficient and interesting as moving heat around buildings than air, actually. Air is a really outmoded idea of it. But so I try to get those elements in there and create atmosphere out of it as well, to say, what if it wasn't only a solution to a problem, or wasn't only a redesign of a fan coil unit, but what if it had architectural features associated with it? Is there any testing of that thing? No. Does it work right now? No. It's a provocation. It's an academic pursuit, that particular thing. So.
No, we asked to engineer to work. We use in the office, we use some software and to modelize the heat and the movement of, but when it's become real, we work with some engineer office, like now we will start to work with Transolar, a German studio. He will be here, Thomas Auer, to modelize the flow of the air and to calculate everything, to see at different months in the year what will be the power of each machine to really to have an effect at 10 centimeter or 1 meter or 3 meter. So we will calculate everything about this. But
interesting in your case, though, that Philippe didn't show these installations that he's done, and one of which we exhibited at my faculty in Toronto, where the installation is very much about the sort of different sort of heat distributions in section, you know, in a space, and the sort of allocation accordingly of different functions of a dwelling. And so Philippe actually installed this. So, you know, the bathtub is really high up because it's warm up there, and then the mattress is low because you don't. So in a way, I mean, that's the test that works as a kind of. And there's sensors also that are you know, it's easier to measure temperature than it is some other things, but anyway, I find it interesting that your installations act as one-to-one sort of. You know.
But I think to answer to the question of the formal question, I think it's interesting. and also it's linked to the work of Te Liu. I think that when we walk, there is two kind of walks. The first, it's not is the same, but we walk on the language of architecture, and with this language we do project. And I think, for example, the work of Te Liu is to work on the language, to work on this to show all this machine, and we understand if we add all this machine together, it changes the atmosphere around, and it go in a very maybe a negative. It's become a critic. But you could turn to this critique to a kind of positive, because me, during a long time, I was doing only critical project. And, you know, it was always a kind of nightmare when I did a project. You know, and I just, one moment someone said, yeah, but you will never build because you are always do critique, and you never turn in the other side. And I said, okay, yeah, why but why I have to stay to only be in the dark side and not to go, and at the end it's not you know, it's because it's not it's just, I think when you are a critic you also invent a new language, a new formal language, and it's why my pretension is to reinvent the formal language, not to use a 60s language, or to use, you know, I want to reinvent everything. I want to choose a material for because there is an albedo quality. I want to choose a form because it's linked to a reflection of something, or I want to reinvent everything. So it's a kind of, it's very pretentious to do it, but and of course it starts. You need to be critical at one moment because you use the critic to destroy, to decompose what you know, and you decompose it, and so you find that iodine and antibiotic on the ground, and you rebuild something from this very essential thing. And it's why also I did a lot of show of exhibition, and because it was a kind of research of a new element of architecture, to research a new language, and yes.
Yeah, I mean,
that's why we were in a lot of show together, because it was always a kind of critique of what it is, or what is a reality, to discover from this critique a new way to design.
I mean, I think that another aspect to this discussion a little bit is the degree to which something can be, something is generative, and you seem to be taking a generative approach based on what you just said, that there are a series of criteria, and that through the assembly of these different kinds of criteria and their related types of materiality or whatever is associated with that performance, that you can let the project bloom on its own terms. No? Is that right? Yeah. Yeah, and so I mean, I think that that's maybe embedded a little bit in some of the things that we're talking about, the generative versus the intuitive or authored kinds of positions, and I can understand both. I mean, but I guess then I think it is even more interesting to consider what Warren was saying, is then what are the techniques then involved? If we're going to talk about something that's generative, I think it's all the more important to actually speak specifically not just about outcomes, but about the techniques to get there. And I don't know about the simulations. I mean, they're very, very powerful now, these physics simulators that are available now. But it's that too is a kind of slippery slope, because the minute you put something in an environment and simulate, let's say, the movement of air, you've changed the movement of air. It's like looking at a site plan and looking at the paths of the way people walk through the site plan, and then using that as your planning strategy to make a building. Of course, the minute you put a building there, you change the way that people walk through the site. So I just wonder about the usefulness. I guess the most useful something like that would be in a feedback loop. a simulation thing. So I'm not sure if you're interested in that. Or, I guess I'm just asking about technique in general.
No, it is the same for the visible. For example, here we have a kind of green room with this grey wall, but people inside with these yellow shoes and purple change completely the visual quality. So it's not so different, I think, of someone in. But yeah, I think there is also maybe something when it's. You know, I don't feel myself as a modernist. I come also from a generation, a very critical generation against technique, and so it's not. I think it's not because you use science and technologies that you have to be completely precise, and you could not accept that sometime some error will appear. And for example, in the Taiwan project, we don't change all the site. We keep some polluted areas, some warm areas, some very area with a lot of moisture, because it's also the richness of the space. It's not to have everything an homogeneous situation. It is to have different quality, and I think this is the difference with the modernity of the beginning of the 20th century. They want to change all the park into a very comfortable. In us, we just change area, but one is polluted, warm and dry. Another is polluted, cold and dry. Another, so it's just to work with climate, but without determinist vision, without. And I think it's important to have this freedom to fix everything in a kind of determinated vision. So it's why the technology and the technique don't have to go in the.
Okay. So I have a question for you. Yeah. Sorry. So how would you feel, because that's also a gigantic project that you just won? How would you feel about playing master planner, and giving, instead of a creative brief, you give a performance brief? And you locate these different patches that you're talking about, and you're saying we're not even dealing with some of the areas, and you invite in 20 architects to do the work. Would that work within your approach, or
no, because I think it's you know, I think architecture is architecture. I don't think that there is a separation between the two fields. No.
Yeah, I was going to make more of a concluding comment. I mean, I thought I think the three voices we saw today were really fantastic in that they're each thinking about a very new issue, but in a way also thinking about a very old issue. I think both from I mean, for me, everything comes back to materials, and I think that's where we never lose our authorship of form and significance as architects. But what I think is always significant is that if you think about air, when you go to very ancient texts and think about materiality, air is considered one of the primary materials, both in terms of a building entity, but also when we think about history of medicine, air was seen as part of our essence, our spirit, our bodies, whatever it is. And so for me, there is the idea of this relationship of now thinking about whether it's uber minimalism that we're returning to air, or a kind of high tech, or a kind of evocative way of thinking, that there's a sensibility about the effect and power and opportunity, I think, of the material sensibility of what air is. So
I want to open it up to questions, but first I do want to say, the issue of the feedback, I think, is super important, right? Both in terms of just the design process, but then actually after it's constructed. And Tom, I mean, your work, of course, is based on the kind of idea of trying to prototype how surface can accommodate, some of these kind of feedback mechanisms, or, certainly the kind of volume or void, right, to allow kind of air to move through it. And Philippe, I mean, you talk about in your work summer and winter, right? But it's hard to kind of see where the feedback mechanisms which would allow kind of variation, and the tectonic or the machinery that would be literally kind of reconfigure a building's response at, if you're talking about a kind of responsive architecture, right? To reconfigure that building's response to the time. It's a little bit hard for me to read at the moment, just with the kind of tectonic components. But I really appreciate everyone joining us today. I think it was a really interesting set of talks and some very interesting conversation. Did anyone have any? Let's see if this thing will reach all the way over there.
This is more a kind of comment, I guess, but just to kind of reflect on this kind of question. The 60s and now seem to have come up in a lot of times today. And I just want to bring it back to a kind of a personality who was here teaching at USC, who was not dealing with air, but dealing with a very similar kind of environmental condition, dealing with the sun. That is Ralph Knowles, who I think has produced some remarkable work. If you talk to Ralph, though, you know what he says is actually his work was largely ignored because people it's kind of postmodernism. They're into form in a big kind of way. And I think there's a slight danger in kind of celebrating Rainer Banham as though he stood for the 60s. I mean, he absolutely didn't. He was a marginal figure. He was a kind of fly in the ointment. He was saying, when everyone was saying LA is a terrible urbanistic city, he was saying, no, it's fantastic. You know? And there are a number of kind of characters we're kind of salvaging now and reappropriating. Probably going back to kind of Gaudi, certainly to kind of Fry Otto, I think Banham and Ralph Knowles in many ways, who were not at all representative of their time. They were 30 or 40 years ahead of their time. And if you actually look at what was going on in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, especially in terms of the kind of intellectual work, it was all kind of history. You know, the figures like Tony Vidler, Kenneth Frampton, Joseph Rickver, this is where all the intellectual work was going on, and the scientists and the environmental engineers, these were these kind of positivistic kind of people who were marginalized from the real debate. Now, things have changed now, I think largely due to a kind of shift that you can see coming out of Deleuze, going through especially Manuel Delander's work, who's kind of like looking at new materialism, trying to sort of see this world of sort of science technology as really a territory that needs to be theorized and thought about really seriously. Now that, I think, is a significant difference between now and the 60s. You know, that people like Cecil Baumann are the superheroes these days, whereas engineers were just kind of like people who made buildings stand up in the 60s. Now, that's a huge sort of difference. Having said all that, you know, I'm just wondering whether, in fact, that sort of divide we're talking about, that bridge that we're talking about between the world of kind of art, culture, whatever it is, and kind of technology, has been made, because I didn't notice a single professor from building science in the audience today. And I wonder, how many students here from building science? Put your hands up. Not a single student from building science here today. What does that say?
What does it say?
Well,
I've asked this a question to you.
there actually is a concurrent NSF grant writing workshop that's going on. I'm not joking. So that's where we lost a few.
Ago when Rem Koolhaas himself was saying that this century is going to be about engineering. I was really shocked to hear him say that, because I don't really see him undertaking that in his work, and I also believe he's a closet formalist. But I think, though, that it's not as cut and dry as you're saying, that this, and that what he was saying, that this will be, that Cecil Baumann is a superhero, which of course he is, and he's fabulous, but it's not clear how engineering can make its way into architecture and not just always be sidelined outside of the discipline of architecture. It's not clear, but I do think that there's a lot there to be worked on. So I mean, I really appreciate what these guys are doing, and I think it's just an open-ended question. But it is a really important question, because society is asking us now, what is the deal? We're in this new austerity phase. We have to be more sustainable. Buildings use 40% of our power, and mostly during construction, not even during their use. Like, what is our response going to be? And I think we need to make a response. Even people who are, let's say, part of the formalism tradition of architecture, there has to be some kind of response. You can't just pretend like it's not there. So.
I just want to put something else out there, too. This past weekend, I was at a conference in Boston, and I saw a lecture by a scientist, a physicist, named Chris Nagel. And it was actually really interesting, because he is proposing that all materials out there can be changed at a property level. And so what we know, for example, of copper, he
claims that he has the ability to change copper so that it's translucent, so that it's insulating, so that it can float. It can do all these different things by the change of property itself. And I think, I know it sounds crazy, but he has, and I'm looking at him thinking, how, you know what I mean, this guy's crazy, but there are people who are saying out there within 5 years this guy is going to get a Nobel Prize, right? And at the same time I thought, wow, if we think of architecture and material of architecture on a material property level, I think it goes along to what Philippe is proposing, that it's not how we think of things before, that it's a completely different way to understand it, which completely blows away the whole argument of form too, because what is form when instantaneously, and he says at almost nanoseconds or nano portions a second, the property can change. What does that mean to architecture too? And so if we're presuming that materiality is as we know it, static and stays the same, and how does that actually inform formally something that Philippe is proposing? But if material also change property, as we believe air can potentially do, what does that mean to the entire range from inside to outside and materiality between the two? So I think that has a forward trajectory that could really change the way we understand and think of architecture. That may not be engineering, but it's probably more of science.
Well, yeah, I guess that's an interesting point. He was probably not talking about buildings that shapeshift, right? But you're talking about more just like the ability to regulate or induce. I mean, kind of to end on a sustainability note, Janka Palicki, the late Janka Palicki of Future Systems, shortly before he died, he said, you know, there hasn't even been a prototype of what a green building in the future would be yet. Like it's still, we're still kind of totally in a different landscape. And that, if you take his vision of the future, architecture is going to change radically, the form of architecture, materials of architecture, or whatnot. So I think it's an interesting moment, a complex moment, and certainly you guys are dealing with that too in studios. So thank you all. Let's get something to eat. I'm hungry.